For decades, these chords have been infiltrating our music, twisting its sound and influencing your mood. They've invaded all styles of music so that no song is safe from their sick harmonic effects. Today, you'll learn to identify these infamous chords so you can protect yourself and your family against boring sounding music. On this episode of Most Wanted Chords.
In the last few pages of the Chord Progression Codex, there's a long list of chords and progressions that have famous nicknames. In this video, I've taken 10 of those chords that I think are interesting and fun, and we're going to discuss how to use them and how to make music with them. Then, at the end of the video, we'll try to take all of those chords and try to cram them together into one piece of music that actually sounds good. I personally think that each of these chords and progressions has their own unique flavor and characteristics. And for a composer, if you can familiarize yourself with those characteristics, then when you're writing music, you can just bring them into your song whenever you want. We'll begin with a very old chord called the Neapolitan Chord, and it gets that name because it was popularized in the 17th century in the Neapolitan School of Music. But the chord is even older than that, as demonstrated by Elam Rotem from Early Music Sources on his video on this topic. The easy way to think about this chord is like this. It's a major triad that's built on the flat second scale degree, so we can write it as flat to major. And this chord is able to pop up in minor keys and major keys. But we'll first talk about it in minor keys. So let's say I'm in the key of A minor, and I'm doing regular A minor stuff like playing the 4 chord, playing the flat 6 chord. I might all of a sudden bring in the Neapolitan chord, B flat major, and then that would probably take me to the dominant chord of E major, which would resolve back to A minor. So maybe you can hear in A minor, B flat major has a pretty surprising sound, but it's a nice, I got this antique flavor out of it. It is an old sounding chord, probably just because we've heard it from so much old music. And this Neapolitan chord is considered a predominant. It's something that usually shows up before my dominant chord. So here, we're using it to always lead us to E major, the dominant, before resolving. However, this chord was often seen in inversion. So the popular way to do it was not just play the flat 2 major chord like B flat, but it was to invert that chord into first inversion. So now you've got B flat over D, which would classically be written like this, B flat 6-3 or B flat 6. So this chord is considered the Neapolitan sixth chord when you invert it. And what it does is it gives you a little bit more of a desirable bass movement. So here is B flat over D, then moving to E, then moving to A minor. If you hear the bass there, the bass is doing something a little bit more interesting. It's going D, E, A. That's a little more comfortable than B flat, E, A. And they're both cool, but sometimes it was desired to have less of a disruptive bass movement. That's why this Neapolitan sixth was so popular. You can hear this chord in the opening measures of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in C sharp minor. Right after just the first few chords, we see an inverted flat 2 chord. This chord can also appear in major keys, and my favorite example is the Indiana Jones theme. After just a few measures in C major, we are all of a sudden treated to this D flat major chord. Next, let's talk about a more recent chord called the Backdoor Chord. And most musicians would agree that this is the Backdoor Chord, a dominant 7th chord built on the flat 7 scale degree. So if I'm in the key of C major, and if I'm doing C major-ish things, you might hear something like a G7 resolving to C major 7. But the backdoor cadence is when we go from the backdoor chord to C major 7 instead. And I want to touch on this word cadence because a lot of people were taught that the word cadence means chord movements at the end of a song or chord movements that appear at the end of a piece. And that's true, but we can expand that definition a little bit and say that a cadence is any popular chord movement, something that keeps happening over and over again. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the end of your song. It might actually occur in the middle. So that's a slightly expanded definition that we'll be using in this video and that most people wouldn't have a problem with. But anyways, this backdoor cadence appears in Layla by Derek and the Dominoes or Eric Clapton. The end of that vamp section is C major, and then they invert the C, and then they have an F. And then finally, we have this backdoor chord, B flat 7, with this nice little scale run. So in the key of C, B flat dominant 7 is that backdoor chord, and it is out of key. All of a sudden, when B flat 7 appears, we have these scale degrees floating around. We have a flat 6 and a flat 7. And because of that, a lot of musicians just say, oh, that's being borrowed from the minor scale, because the minor scale has those degrees too. So a lot of musicians will play the minor scale over the top. But when this chord appears, you're free to just lower the 6th and the 7th, and what you're left with is a scale like this called Mixolydian flat 6. And that's what we're actually hearing here at the end of Layla. We're hearing a natural major third. We're not hearing a minor third. But we could play the minor scale over that chord instead, which is nice too. They're both nice. I just want you to be aware that you don't just have one option when the backdoor chord appears in your major key. Now in minor keys, this is totally in key, so there's nothing really special about the backdoor chord in minor keys. It just sounds fine and it works well. But in major keys, I also think it's helpful to just simplify this a little bit. It doesn't have to be a dominant 7th chord. The backdoor chord could just simply be the flat 7 chord. And I like thinking of this still as being a backdoor cadence because it has a lot of the same kind of bumping up effect to my ears, and it kind of simplifies things. Now I could say that it's maybe borrowed from Mixolydian instead, because the only note I need to make this chord is flat 7. It's the only non-diatonic note there. If we're in C, we can approach C through the back door. But what if we want to approach the back door through the back door? Well, then we could move a whole step again, and we'd have A flat to B flat to C. And that gives you these 3 chords. These 3 chords. I think this is a hilarious chord progression, and it goes by many different names. One is the double backdoor cadence, for reasons that should be obvious. The other is the Billy Shears cadence, because we'll hear it at the beginning of With a Little Help from My Friends, as the Beatles scream out the name Billy Shears. And I've also heard it referred to as the Mario cadence, because of its many appearances in that video game and the theme song. I did a really fun lesson on this chord progression, so if you're interested in it, I recommend you check it out. But I'll just give you the summary of it here. You can use this cadence as a surprising, epic, fireworks, unexpected ending to a mediocre song. So let's say your song normally just ended with a 1, a 4, a 5, and then the 1. Well, you could disrupt that with something like a 1, a 4, and then bring in the Mario cadence, and the fireworks come out, the confetti's in the air, everybody's cheering. So it's a very simple chord progression, but there's a lot to talk about, which is why I did make an entire video just on that. Next, let's talk about music's most feared chord, the Augmented Sixth Chord. This chord is not an augmented chord. It is also not a 6th chord, as you're probably taught that they should be. It comes in 3 flavors, Italian, German, and French, and those areas have no connection to the chord at all. This is why people hate music theory. I get it. I don't want to get into the gory details. I'm going to really simplify this topic, and I'm going to say that the Augmented Sixth Chord is just this. It is a dominant 7th chord that appears on the flat 6 scale degree. And once again, it's a predominant, so it's probably going to move to this chord. You can hear this in minor keys in a song like The Thrill Is Gone by B.B. King, which is in B minor. And it starts with a B minor 7. There's also an E minor 7, the 4 in there. But then eventually you're going to hear a G dominant 7 to the dominant chord. And you can hear that G7 has some extra flair, some extra funk to it that helps really add a crunchy resolution to our dominant chord before resolving to B minor 7. Or you could look to the Beatles' I Want You, which is in D minor. It walks up this D minor scale. And then we have a funny version of a 2 chord. Then we have the Augmented Sixth Chord, the flat 6, which then goes to the dominant chord. But the dominant chord is actually played as an augmented chord, which if you watch my video on augmented chords, you know that it's pretty common to play your dominant chord as an augmented chord instead, and then resolve it. Now I know I'm going to get yelled at for simplifying this topic down to this basic of an idea, but I sincerely believe that if you're a modern composer trying to make modern sounding music, there is no reason you need to study the nuanced details between voice leading the German versus the French versus the enharmonic German. They are fascinating topics, and if you're curious and if you like learning like I do, you should study them, but they are not required for the modern songwriter. What is required for the modern songwriter is to be familiar with the Royal Road chord progression. That name has been given us through the Japanese. It's a translation of a Japanese word, because this chord progression is immensely popular in Japanese music today, and it has been for decades. However, you'll also hear it all over the Western world too. It can be thought of two different ways. So these are two different numeral functions depending on if you're thinking of the major key or the minor key. And I personally like to think of it like this, which is a little strange because there's no one chord, there's no tonic chord. But I really like to think that this chord progression is the key of C, but we're just playing the 4 chord, and then the 5 chord, and then the 3 chord, and then the 6 chord. And those 4 chords really flow very well with one another, and you could loop them all day long and write a song just like that. There's not much to say about the theory behind this chord progression other than it's very easy to use and it's very popular, but I do want you to just keep in mind that it could be in the key of A minor, where this is my starting point and my ending point, but it also could be a chord progression that we hear in the key of C major, right? Because it resolves very well to the key of C. So you might be in the key of C major and you might feature this chord progression a little bit, or you might be in the key of A minor and you might feature this progression a little bit, or you might just loop this over and over again. They're all popular and fun ways to use this progression. Next, we have the Hollywood chord, or the Hollywood cadence. This is a really fun, dramatic sound that can be described like this. It's a half diminished chord built off of the second scale degree. So in the key of C, my second scale degree is D, and we normally have a D minor chord there, but what if we make it a half diminished chord instead? We get that sorrowful resolution back to C. And you're going to hear this for a brief flash in the 20th Century Fox fanfare element at the beginning of all the movies. But it doesn't just appear there. It was a popular movement back in the day of old cinema, and I've provided some really great resources about this chord and its origin and the name that it comes from. That's all linked below in the description. I think it's easiest to just think of this chord as being borrowed from minor, but there's an important little thing I want you to focus on here. If I'm in C major, it's also very popular to do a minor Plagal cadence, another famous chord progression. And that's when you take the 4 chord and you make it minor. So here's a minor, F minor instead, resolving back to C, and you can hear how bittersweet that sound is, right? Well, if I add a D note to my F minor, then I have the exact same notes as a D minor 7 flat 5. So 2 half diminished is the exact same thing as 4 minor 6th, right? They're the same set of notes, just twisted around. They're just inversions of one another. So this Hollywood cadence, resolving to C, has a lot of the same feeling as just moving from minor 4 to 1. Now, let's learn another old chord progression, but this one is very useful for major keys and minor keys. It's very popular to do your 1 chord, and then your 5 chord, and your 1 chord. And if you listen to the bass note there, it's going C, G, C. But if I invert my first C chord into second inversion, then it puts G on the bass. And now my bass movement is going to go G, G, C, which to me has a more regal feel. G, 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 C. That's totally different feel than bum, bum, bum. And that's the value of the Cadential 6/4. It gives you this nice, smooth resolution. Also in minor keys. So if I'm in the key of A minor, for example, right, then the dominant chord would be E major. But what I could do instead is I could play A minor over E, and then E major, and then resolve to a full A minor. I think the real value of this is combining it with some of these other concepts. So in the key of A minor, what if I all of a sudden bring in my Neapolitan Sixth Chord, and then instead of going to my dominant chord, I do something like a Cadential 6/4. So right there you can hear I've got a very nice kind of expanded, prolonged resolution that really is getting us into those old-timey chord progressions that you've probably heard if you ever turned on classical radio. I'd also encourage you to combine suspensions with this concept. So here's A minor, here's an F just for fun, here's the Neapolitan chord. Now here is A minor over E, and then E suspended 4 to E, and then back to A minor. So we're expanding things even further. By the way, I have to say at this point, if you like everything that's going on, you are going to love the Chord Progression Codex. It's an entire book filled with examples and usages of the chords that we're discussing and way more. It's available on my website as a physical book, or you can get a digital version as well that comes with a formatted ebook. Hundreds of audio examples. The reviews have been great. I highly recommend it. Now, we'll end things with a happy, bright note, which is the Picardy Third. And that's exactly what a Picardy Third is, a bright, happy ending when you couldn't quite expect it. So in the key of A minor, for example, we might hear an F and then the dominant chord E, but then all of a sudden we might resolve to A major, and it's like, everything's okay. This was a very popular trick to play back in the classical day, but it still happens now, and this is another one I've done an entire video on, so there's plenty of examples there. But what I'd like to do now is try to take all of the chords that we've seen and try to apply them into one single chord progression and then make music with that. So I wrote them all down on a piece of paper and got out my guitar, and in about 45 minutes I was able to string together this line of chords. It's in the key of A minor, and it starts off with the Royal Road chord progression. So we're going to have F to G to E minor to A minor. But then we go straight into the Neapolitan Sixth Chord, which is supposed to go to the dominant chord, E, but I don't go to the dominant chord. I do a Cadential 6/4, so A minor over E, and then E, which is supposed to take me to A minor. But I don't go to A minor, I do a Picardy Third, so the sun's coming out. And now we're in the key of A major. That's helped me pivot into this new key of A major. So I play an A major 7 just for fun. We'll do the 4 chord, D major 7. I bring in the Hollywood chord, the minor 7, flat 5 on the 2, and now back to my tonic, A major, and then we'll just do the 6 chord, F sharp minor 7. Now we'll do the double backdoor cadence, the Billy Shears cadence, and that's the big firework grand ending. Again, the 6th chord kind of like for a turnaround feel. And now we're going to have the augmented 6th chord, F7, that crunchy resolution to E major, which should take me to A to end things. But nope, we're going to get there through the back door. First we'll play G7, and then we'll resolve to A major 7. So that's the entire chord progression I wrote, which is fine, I mean, but it's just a chord progression. You need to turn it into music. So what I did is I added drums, I added guitar, I added all sorts of different layers to turn it into an actual piece of music. If you're curious about all of those steps, you should head over to my Patreon. I'm posting a video there very shortly on the behind the scenes of how I actually built the track, and I've also posted the guitar tabs and the bass tabs so you can try playing along if you'd like. So let's take a listen to it, but before we do, I'd like your help in trying to label the genre. I don't usually write music like this, and I kind of want to call it like jazz, prog, rock, fusion, but a lot of it just gives me like Price is Right vibes, like something you'd hear during the credit rolls. So I don't know, give me your thoughts. So I really dig that sound, and hopefully you were able to hear those featured little chords as they popped out, and hopefully you're starting to gain some familiarity with them so you can really just detect them and know when they're present without having to do any calculations or theory work. You know, they all have their own smell, and if you can smell them correctly and you can identify it, it smells like an augmented 6th chord, it makes your ear training a lot easier. It's like nose training instead of ear training. I don't know if that makes sense, but either way, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you found it educational. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting that like button, subscribing to this channel so you're notified of my next lesson. That kind of stuff really helps me out. And a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If it wasn't for them, these videos wouldn't exist, and if they did, they'd be covered with ads from start to finish. So they certainly got my appreciation, and I hope they have yours as well. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.